Remove your clothing for inspection. The words landed in the heat like a metal tool dropped on concrete. Sharp, final, and far too practiced to sound human. In the processing yard, the sun hung low and white, bleaching color out of everything it touched. The dusty boards, the rolled canvas, the stamped numbers on crates, the pale chalk lines that told people where to stand and how not to move. Beyond the fence, palm fronds stirred in a wind that never reached the skin. Inside the fence, the air felt thick, as if it had weight. A line of women stood shoulder to shoulder, close enough that their sleeves nearly brushed, not close enough to borrow warmth. They had been marched in from the trucks with their eyes forward and their mouths closed. Each step timed to the rhythm of boots and shouted counts. Their shoes, some rubber-soled, some worn leather, some little more than cloth, left faint prints that the next gust would erase. There were no names on the clipboard, only categories and tallies, as if the war could be managed by columns. Aiko Tanaka stood near the center of the line, her posture straight not because she was unafraid, but because fear was a thing she refused to display like an offering. The collar of her plain blouse was damp with sweat. Strands of hair had slipped from its tie and clung to her cheek. She did not look at the guards when they spoke. She looked past them, at the corner of the supply shed where a shadow made a narrow strip of shade, and she measured in her mind how small mercy could be and still count as mercy. Beside her, Mrs. Sato's hands trembled once, then stilled, folding over one another the way someone folds a letter they do not want to read. Around them, the other women held their breath in uneven patterns, each inhalation cautious, each exhale delayed, like they were waiting for permission to exist. Sergeant Daniel Brooks stood with a file in his hand, the paper already creased from being opened and closed too many times. He was not cruel in the theatrical way men imagine cruelty. He was efficient, and that efficiency was its own kind of danger. He had a job, and the job had instructions, and the instructions had been printed far from this yard by people who would never see a face when they made a rule. Standard intake, he said, as if that phrase could turn discomfort into necessity. A young guard, Corporal Ethan Reed, stood off to the side with a rifle slung but idle, eyes fixed on a point above everyone's heads, like he could keep his conscience clean by refusing to witness. The women's stillness pressed against him anyway. Then Captain Robert Hale stepped into the yard, not loudly, not making a performance of arrival, just a man with sunburn at the edge of his collar and a tired look that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. He had come to check a shipment and a schedule, to make sure the day moved the way a day was supposed to move. He stopped when he heard the sentence, because some words carried more weight than their syllables. He watched Aiko lift her chin a fraction, not in defiance, not in pleading, only in the stubborn act of remaining herself. Hale had seen surrender. He had seen rage. What stopped him now was neither. It was dignity, quiet and intact, standing in a place designed to grind everything down. For one long second, nobody moved. Even the flags beyond the yard seemed to hang still. And in that pause, the war did not end, but it hesitated, just enough for one man to decide whether victory would be counted in procedures or in restraint. Captain Robert Hale did not raise his voice, because raising it would have made the moment about power, and he already had that. He let the silence do its work, the kind of silence that made men notice their own breathing. Sergeant Daniel Brooks shifted his weight, as if the change in stance could change the order he had just given. The paper in his hand fluttered once, then went still. "Captain," Brooks said, careful, respectful, the way a man speaks when he wants the rule to stand but does not want to be the one blamed for it. He tapped the clipboard with one finger. "Standard intake procedure. Contraband check. Hidden items. We have to keep the area secure." Hale looked at the clipboard, then passed it, back to the line of women. He did not study them like a problem. He studied the space around them, the way the sun hit their shoulders, the way the fence threw thin shadows across. The dirt, the way a human being could be turned into a checklist if everyone agreed not to look too closely. Aiko Tanaka kept her hands at her sides. Her fingers did not fidget. That steadiness was not stubbornness. It was a decision. She had learned, somewhere long before this yard, that some things were taken only if you offered them. She would not offer. She would endure, but she would not cooperate with humiliation. Mrs. Sato swallowed and lifted her eyes just enough to see the ground in front of her shoes, like she was choosing where to place her dignity so it would not be trampled. Corporal Ethan Reed stared at a knot in the wooden shed wall. His jaw worked once. He was young enough to still believe that if he did not look, it did not count. Hale watched him, too, because a war did not end when the shooting stopped. It ended when men stopped carrying it into the way they treated strangers. What is the rationale for this step? Hale asked. His tone was even, the way an officer asked about fuel inventory or truck mileage. Brooks blinked, as if the question itself was unusual. Search, sir, he answered. Women can conceal things under clothing. Hale nodded slowly, not agreeing, not arguing, just letting the words hang in the heat so everyone could hear how small they sounded when spoken out loud. And what do you do when the search is done? Hale asked. Brooks hesitated. Issue replacement garments if needed, sir. Move them to holding. Hale glanced toward the supply shed. Canvas rolls. A stack of blankets. A narrow folding screen leaning against the wall like it had been forgotten. The materials for a better choice were already here. That was what made it impossible to ignore. Sergeant, Hale said, you can conduct a security inspection without stripping a line of prisoners in open view. Brooks tightened his grip on the clipboard. Sir, the manual. Hale cut him off with a small lift of his hand. Not dramatic, just final. The manual does not outrank my orders. He stepped closer, stopping a few feet short of the line, keeping a respectful distance. He did not speak to them as if they were children. He spoke as if they were people who had survived something he could not fully see. We will do this. One at a time, he said, to the yard, to the guards, to the air itself. We will use a screen and blankets. We will keep a perimeter. No spectators. We will have a female attendant if one is available, and if not, we will keep the process as private and brief as possible. Is that understood? Brooks opened his mouth, then closed it. Reed exhaled like he had been holding his breath for miles. Aiko did not move, but something in her gaze shifted, not into relief, not into gratitude, but into recognition, the rare moment when an authority chose restraint. Hale turned his head slightly, eyes on Brooks, and said the sentence that ended the old procedure without apology. Not like this. The order moved through the yard without another shouted command, like a change in weather that everyone felt before they understood it. Sergeant Daniel Brooks walked to the supply shed with the stiff steps of a man who did not want to appear corrected, pulled the folding screen free, and dragged it across the dirt until it stood upright, wobbling once before he set its legs. Corporal Ethan Reed brought 2 army blankets from the stack, their rough wool smelling faintly of soap and storage, and held them out as if he was unsure where his hands belonged. Captain Robert Hale did not hurry them. He watched the perimeter, pointed to 2 soldiers to face outward instead of inward, and adjusted the geometry of the space until it looked less like an audience and more like a boundary. The change was small, but it changed everything. A line had been drawn where curiosity would not cross. In the strip of shade beside the shed, a female corpsman stepped forward from behind a crate, her sleeves rolled, her expression tired but steady, as if she had been waiting for an adult decision all morning. Hale nodded to her, brief and grateful, then spoke quietly to Brooks, too low for the line to hear. Brooks answered with a tight nod, the kind that meant compliance, not agreement. Aiko Tanaka watched the screen rise like a wall that had not existed a minute ago. Her breath went in shallow, careful measures, and she counted them the way she used to count steps between a well and a kitchen door, long before war turned counting into survival. The women behind her shifted slightly, not breaking formation, just redistributing fear so it did not crush any one person alone. Mrs. Sato's fingers unclasped, then reclasped, as if she had just remembered she could choose what to do with her hands. Hale stepped forward, stopping again at a respectful distance. He did not say, I am sorry, because apologies were not always the cleanest form of respect. He did not say, it will be fine, because he could not promise that. Instead, he gave them something more practical. You will be processed one at a time, he said, his voice level enough to carry without cutting. You will have privacy behind the screen. You will keep your personal belongings together. You will receive your issued items immediately afterward. No one will speak to you unnecessarily. He paused, then added a final instruction to his own men. If anyone makes a comment, if anyone stares, if anyone treats this like entertainment, they will answer to me. Brooks's mouth twitched, almost a protest, but he swallowed it. Reed lowered his eyes to the ground. not in shame exactly, but in the awkward relief of a young man being told how to act like one. The corpseman beckoned, palm up, not grabbing, not pushing. The first woman in line stepped forward. Her shoulders were rigid at first, then eased a fraction when the blanket was held like a curtain rather than a net. Aiko did not watch the woman go behind the screen. She watched the men who would have watched. She watched how quickly their attention shifted away when Hale's gaze stayed on them. It was not kindness like a warm gift. It was discipline, and discipline felt safer than mercy that could be withdrawn. The minutes passed with the slow weight of a long day. There were murmurs of instruction from the corpseman, low and professional, and the soft rasp of fabric, and then the woman returned to the line with a small bundle of issued items in her arms, her face unreadable except for the tiniest lift of the chin. One by one, the process repeated, private, brief, controlled. And with each repetition, a strange quiet spread through the yard, because everyone, on both sides of the fence, had expected something uglier. When it came time for Aiko, she stepped forward with measured pace, the dirt warm under her soles, the sun pressing down like a hand. She stopped at the edge of the screen and looked once at Captain Hale. She did not smile. She did not nod. She simply held his gaze long enough for him to understand that she had seen the choice he made. Then she moved behind the barrier, and outside it, every soldier in the yard seemed to forget how to speak. Outside the screen, time did not move the way it used to. It moved like a cautious hand, inching forward only when it was told it could. Captain Robert Hale remained in the yard, not because his presence was required for paperwork, but because presence was the point. A decision without enforcement was only a thought. Sergeant Daniel Brooks stood near the supply shed, jaw set, eyes flicking between the line and the clipboard as if he could will the old procedure back into place by staring hard enough. Corporal Ethan Reed kept his post facing outward, shoulders squared, a young man trying to look like he understood what discipline meant. The heat pressed down. Somewhere beyond the fence, an engine coughed and then settled into a steady idle. A gull cried once overhead, sharp as a whistle, then vanished into the glare. The corpseman worked with efficient calm behind the screen, her voice low, firm, professional, never playful, never impatient. Aiko Tanaka could hear the cadence of it even without catching every word. It did not sound like command. It sounded like a boundary. When she stepped back out, a blanket folded over her arm, her issued items bundled neatly, she did not look relieved. Relief would have been a surrender of its own. She looked composed, and composition was harder. The women behind her watched her face the way people watch a weather report when they have no shelter. Aiko gave them nothing dramatic, only a steady gaze that said the same thing her posture had said all day: do not give them your collapse. Mrs. Sato stepped forward next, guided by the corpseman's open hand. As Mrs. Sato disappeared behind the screen, Brooks took a step toward Hale, voice kept low but tight around the edges. Sir, with respect, this takes longer, he said. We have quotas. We have schedules. We have men to rotate. Hale did not turn quickly. He turned slowly, as if he had all the time in the world, and that calm itself was a warning. Then we will adjust the schedule, he answered. Security is not an excuse for spectacle. Brooks's nostrils flared. It is not spectacle, sir. It is procedure. Hale looked at him, and in that look there was no anger, only clarity. Procedure is what we choose to repeat, he said. Choose better. Brooks glanced past Hale toward the line, toward faces he had been trained to treat as risks, and for a brief second his eyes caught Aiko's. He looked away first. Reed saw it too. Reed had been watching hands and boots and fence lines because that was what he understood. Now he watched eyes, because Hale had forced him to understand something else. Reed shifted his rifle strap higher on his shoulder, not to threaten anyone, but to give his own hands something to do so they would not shake. He swallowed and spoke, barely more than a breath. Captain, he said, do we need more screens? Hale did not smile, but the corners of his expression softened, like a door not fully opening, but no longer locked. Yes, he said, and we need more blankets. He pointed to the supply list like it mattered as much as any ammunition count. Make it happen. The corpseman emerged with Mrs. Sato a few minutes later. Mrs. Sato held her issued items with both hands, and her shoulders sat higher than before, as if someone had returned a small weight she did not know she had lost. She did not thank anyone. She did not bow. She simply stepped back into the line and stood with a steadier spine. Hale watched the women settle again into their formation, and he noticed what no clipboard could record, the way their breathing changed, the way fear stopped being the only thing in the air. It did not vanish. It just stopped being in charge. Aiko looked toward the screen once, then toward the fence, then toward the sky. The sun still burned. The war still existed. Orders still traveled down chains of command like water through pipes. But in this yard, over a stretch of maybe 30 yards of dirt and canvas and borrowed shade, one chain had been bent into something else. Hale took a pen from his pocket and wrote a short note on the intake form, not for drama, not for history, but for tomorrow. Privacy screen required. Blankets required. No exceptions. He handed it to Brooks. Brooks stared at the ink, then nodded, slow and reluctant. Aiko watched the exchange and understood the strange truth of it. The paper mattered, not because it was powerful, but because it was proof that someone had decided to make decency repeatable. By late afternoon, the processing yard looked the same to anyone passing by in a jeep. The same fence, the same dust, the same sun bleaching the world until every shadow looked thin and tired. But inside the fence, something had shifted, and the men who worked there felt it in ways they could not easily name. Captain Robert Hale walked the perimeter with a slow, measured pace, as if he was inspecting more than a boundary. He was watching how habits formed, how quickly a small cruelty tried to return when nobody was paying attention. Behind him, Sergeant Daniel Brooks kept the line moving with clipped instructions that avoided unnecessary words. He did not like the delay, and he did not like being corrected in front of his men. Yet he followed the new method because orders were orders, and because Hale had turned the new method into something that could be repeated without debate. Corporal Ethan Reed brought another blanket, then another, making 2 trips to the supply shed until his arms itched from the wool. He did not complain. He did not talk. He simply moved, eyes down, face set, as if he was trying to repay an invisible debt he had not known he owed. Aiko Tanaka stood with the others at the edge of the holding area, their issued items clutched close, their bodies aligned to a chalk line that promised order but did not promise comfort. The women were escorted in small groups now, guided to a shaded corner where they were given water from a dented metal canteen cup that smelled faintly of chlorine and sun-heated steel. The water was lukewarm, but it was water. Aiko took a careful sip, then handed the cup to Mrs. Sato without being asked. Mrs. Sato drank more slowly, as if she expected the cup to be snatched away for drinking too much. Nobody snatched it. The absence of that threat felt strange, almost suspicious. The corpsman returned with a small stack of forms, her fingers smudged with pencil. Graphite, her brow damp with sweat. She spoke to Hale briefly, words too quiet to catch, and Hale nodded, then turned toward Reed. "Find out where we can get another screen," he said. "Even a sheet hung on poles will do." Reed looked surprised to be addressed like a capable person, then answered clearly, "Yes, sir," and jogged off. Brooks watched him go and muttered, half to himself, "We are running a camp, not a church." Hale did not react to the remark at first. He crouched instead beside a crate, took a canteen cup in his own hand, and poured a small amount of water onto the dust. The dirt darkened for a moment, then drank it away. "A camp," Hale said, standing again, "is exactly where standards matter." Brooks's eyes narrowed. "Standards, sir, or sentiments?" Hale looked at the clipboard tucked under Brooks's arm, at the checkboxes and timestamps. "Standards," he repeated. "Sentiments are optional. Standards are policy." Brooks's grip tightened, then loosened. He had expected a speech. He got a sentence instead, and sentences were harder to argue with because they left no room to wrestle. Aiko watched the exchange from a distance. She did not understand every English word, but she understood tone, posture, the way men addressed each other when a line of authority was being redrawn. She saw Brooks lean forward as if to press, then step back as if he had met a wall. She saw Hale remain still, not swelling with pride, not performing decency, just holding it. The yard continued to move. Screen, blanket, private instructions, return to the line. And with each cycle, the guards' faces became less eager to prove something and more focused on simply finishing the work without harm. Aiko's mind recorded the details the way a careful person records exits in an unfamiliar building. The location of the shade, The position of the screen, the direction the guards faced, the fact that the captain stayed until the last woman was processed. When the sun finally dipped and the air cooled by a few degrees, a runner arrived with a bundle of paperwork and a stamped message. Hale read it, then folded it into his pocket without comment. He glanced once at the line of women, then at the men on duty. Same method tomorrow, he said. Write it into the rotation notes. Brooks hesitated, then nodded. Reed returned holding 2 wooden poles and a length of canvas. Breathing hard, face streaked with sweat and determination. Hale took one end of the canvas and helped him loop it over the poles, not as a grand gesture, but as a quiet instruction. This is how it will be done. Aiko watched that, too, and for the first time all day, her shoulders lowered a fraction, not because she trusted the camp, but because she recognized something rarer than comfort. She recognized a man choosing restraint as if it were part of his uniform. Morning came in a different kind of heat, the kind that had not yet turned cruel, but promised it would by noon. The processing yard was already awake, not because anyone wanted to be, but because schedules did not wait for comfort. A thin haze sat over the dirt like gauze. The fence lines looked the same, the guard tower silhouette unchanged, yet the canvas screen Hale and Reed had rigged the day before stood like a quiet statement nobody could unsee. 2 poles, a length of canvas, a simple refusal to treat human dignity as optional equipment. Captain Robert Hale arrived early, sleeves rolled, collar damp, carrying a small folder that had been signed and stamped. He did not announce it. He handed it to Sergeant Daniel Brooks with the same calm he used for ration counts. This is the updated intake note, Hale said. It is now the standard for this post. Brooks took the paper as if it were heavier than it looked. His eyes scanned it, jaw tightening at the line that made the change official. Sir, he said, careful again. Higher command did not ask for this. Hale looked at him. Higher command asked for order, he replied. Order includes restraint. Brooks's mouth pressed into a thin line. He folded the paper and slid it onto the clipboard, right on top, where nobody could pretend it did not exist. Corporal Ethan Reed watched the exchange from near the supply shed. He had slept poorly, not from fear of battle, but from the slow ache of realizing how easily he had accepted what should have felt wrong. He had come early too, carrying a second canvas length he had borrowed from storage, hoping nobody would ask questions he could not answer. When Hale glanced his way, Reed straightened and held up the roll. I found more material, sir, he said, voice steady, words fully formed. Hale nodded once. Good work, he answered, and that simple recognition did something to Reed's spine, as if it reminded him he could be more than a pair of hands. The next transport arrived before the sun climbed high, a truck rumbling in, dust curling behind it. More women, more exhausted faces, more careful steps into an unfamiliar yard. The same moment repeated itself, the chalk line, the stillness, the guarded breathing. But this time, there was no sentence thrown like a weapon. Brooks read the instructions in a neutral tone and pointed to the screen without drama. The corpsman stepped forward, already in place, her posture saying, "This is how it is done here." The women looked at one another, uncertain, then watched as the first person was guided behind the canvas with a blanket held up as a barrier and not a threat. Aiko Tanaka stood in the holding area with Mrs. Sato and the others from the previous day, now assigned to a section of the camp marked by wooden signs and numbers. They were not free, but they were no longer suspended in that first moment of intake, where everything could be taken with one careless order. Aiko observed the new arrivals the way she observed weather, with practical attention. She saw shoulders still tense, hands still clenched, but she also saw something else, the absence of a crowd, the guards facing outward, the deliberate space where privacy had been built out of canvas and discipline. Mrs. Sato leaned closer to Aiko and spoke in a low voice, a few words, soft enough to be swallowed by the yard noise. Aiko answered with a quiet nod. They did not celebrate. They did not trust the camp to stay decent on its own. They understood that decency required maintenance, like a fire that went out if nobody fed it. Hale walked the line once, checking for lapses the way an officer checked for loose wiring or a leaking fuel line. He caught one soldier lingering too long near the screen, not doing anything overt, just hovering. Hale did not shout. He stepped closer and spoke in a tone that carried consequence without theater. Face outward, he said. The soldier snapped his eyes forward immediately, cheeks flushing. Reed saw that, and he learned the difference between rules written on paper and rules enforced by presence. Brooks saw it too, and something in him adjusted, not into admiration, but into acceptance that the captain meant what he said. The yard continued its work, slow and methodical, and by midday the process had become almost routine, which was the point. Routine could be cruel, but it could also be protective if the routine was built right. As the sun hammered down, the canvas screen cast a narrow, moving shadow, never wide enough to be comfortable, but wide enough to count. Aiko watched that shadow slide across the dirt and thought of how small a boundary could be and still change the whole shape of a day. She did not have to speak for anyone to understand it. The quiet ones, she knew, were never truly ordinary, and sometimes the loudest thing in a war was a man choosing to keep his power on a leash. By the third day, the camp had a new kind of rumor, the kind that did not travel with laughter, but with lowered voices and careful glances. Men repeated it the way they repeated weather updates, not as gossip, but as information you use to decide how to behave. Hale changed intake. One soldier said near the mess line, eyes on his tray. Screen and blankets. No crowd. Another answered with a shrug that tried to look indifferent. He is soft, someone muttered, but the word did not land the way it was meant to. Soft was not what the yard felt like now. The yard felt controlled. And control, everyone understood, was not weakness. Sergeant Daniel Brooks felt the rumor like grit in his boots. Every time he heard Hale's name paired with the new procedure, it reminded him that something had shifted in his own authority. He did not say that out loud. He corrected men on small details instead. Spacing, timing, forms filled out properly, boots aligned on the chalk line. He tightened the screws he could still reach. But the new standard held, because it was written down, and because the captain kept showing up like a hinge that never loosened. Corporal Ethan Reed started to notice who tried to test boundaries. A soldier would drift a few steps inward, pretending he needed to check equipment, eyes lingering too long toward the canvas. Reed would clear his throat, or step into the space, or glance toward Hale, and the soldier would suddenly remember something urgent at the fence line. Reed did not feel like a hero. He felt like a guard who had finally learned what he was supposed to guard. In the women's section, Aiko Tanaka listened more than she spoke. The camp had its own rhythms now. Roll call, water, assigned work, quiet hours that were never truly quiet because the world was full of metal sounds. Aiko watched the new arrivals settle into the routine, saw fear harden into caution, saw caution soften into endurance. Mrs. Sato sat beside her one afternoon under a narrow strip of shade cast by a barracks roof, their backs against rough boards warmed by sun. Mrs. Sato's hands moved as she spoke, small gestures, as if she was shaping her words carefully so they would not break. Aiko answered in short phrases, then looked toward the processing yard as another truck arrived. Even from a distance, she could see the screen set in place, the canvas hung straight, the blankets folded and ready, the guards positioned facing outward. It was a simple picture, almost ordinary now, and that ordinariness was its own kind of protection. The camp, however, was not a sealed world. A staff car arrived that same afternoon, tires crunching over gravel, paint too clean to belong here. A lieutenant from headquarters stepped out, cap brim low, clipboard tucked under his arm, eyes scanning with the cool interest of an inspector. He spoke with Brooks first, then with Hale, and the temperature of the yard seemed to change even though the sun did not. Brooks straightened, eager to demonstrate compliance with the larger machine. Hale did not straighten. He stayed steady. The lieutenant glanced at the screen, at the canvas poles, at the blankets stacked like equipment. "This is not standard issue procedure," he said, voice flat. Hale answered without heat. "It is now standard for this post," he said. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. "On whose authority?" Hale did not gesture to rank with a flourish. He simply stated it. "Mine," he said, "and I documented it." He pulled the stamped note from his folder and offered it. Paper changed hands. The lieutenant read, lips pressed thin. Brooks watched like a man waiting for a verdict. Reed felt his stomach tighten, though he did not. Know why? Because no one had done anything wrong, and yet he had learned that doing right did not always protect you from consequences. The lieutenant looked up. "You believe this is necessary," he said, not quite a question. Hale held his gaze. "I believe restraint is necessary," he answered. The The lieutenant's eyes flicked toward the line of incoming prisoners, toward the guards facing outward. For a moment, his expression softened into something that might have been understanding or might have been calculation. Then his face returned to neutral. "Maintain security," he said, as if that was the only language he trusted. Hale nodded once. "We are," he replied. The lieutenant hesitated, then handed back the paper. "Do not let it become disorder," he said, and walked away. After the car left, the yard exhaled. Brooks did not speak for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said, "You took a risk, sir." Hale looked at the screen, at the small moving shadow it cast, and answered in the same calm tone he used for everything that mattered. "No," he said. "I set a limit." The days after the inspection visit did not turn gentle, but they turned predictable, and predictability was a kind of shelter. The canvas screen stayed up. The blankets stayed folded. The guards kept their faces outward, and even when a new shift rotated in, Sergeant Daniel Brooks made sure the first thing they learned was not where to stand, but where not to look. He spoke it like a rule of discipline, not a lesson in empathy, because discipline was the language his men obeyed. "You face the fence," he told them. "You keep your eyes on the perimeter. You do your job, and you move on." Some nodded too quickly, eager to seem tough. Others nodded slowly, grateful for clarity. Corporal Ethan Reed started to carry extra blankets without being asked. He would pull them from storage, shake out the dust, fold them with square corners, and stack them where the corpsman could reach them in one motion. He did it the way he had been taught to do everything in the Army, quietly, correctly, without complaint. Yet the quiet had changed. It was no longer the quiet of avoidance. It was the quiet of responsibility. In the women's section, Aiko Tanaka learned how small changes left traces. A new arrival would step off the truck with stiff legs and a guarded face, expecting the first moment to be the worst moment. Then she would see the screen, and the way the guards held their positions, and the way the corpsman kept her voice low and professional. The new arrival would still be afraid, because fear did not vanish on command, but she would not be shocked into collapse. Aiko watched it happen again and again, and she understood the strange power of a standard. It did not remove captivity. It did not erase loss. But it prevented one specific kind of degradation from becoming a ritual. Mrs. Sato noticed it too, and one evening she spoke to Aiko in a whisper, the kind of whisper that carried more weight than loud speech. Aiko answered with a brief nod, then looked toward the fence line where the sky burned orange for a few minutes before fading into the dull blue of night. In that dim light, the camp sounded different. Fewer unnecessary shouts. More ordinary footsteps. More doors opening and closing without the extra slam that said, "Remember who is in charge." Captain Robert Hale did not linger in the yard every day after that. He had other duties, other paperwork, other problems that did not fit neatly into a moral equation. But he returned often enough that nobody forgot the rule had a living spine. When he did not appear, Brooks enforced it anyway, because Hale had done something Brooks could not ignore. He had made restraint part of the system, not a favor. One afternoon, a soldier from another post stopped by the processing yard, eyes curious, mouth half-smiling the way men smiled when they thought they were about to enjoy a story. He glanced at the canvas and said, "What is this?" "A theater curtain." Reed felt heat rise in his face before he could stop it. Brooks stepped forward first, voice clipped. "It is privacy," he said. "You will keep moving." The visiting soldier laughed once, then saw the lack of humor in Brooks's eyes, and the laugh died quickly. He walked on. Reed watched him go and realized something. The screen was not only protecting prisoners. It was protecting the guards from becoming the kind of men who needed to laugh at someone else's shame. That night, Hale sat in his office with a small desk fan that did little more than push warm air around. He wrote a short memo, not a speech, not a confession, just a few sentences about intake standards, privacy measures, and the effectiveness of orderly procedure. He made sure the language was practical, because practicality traveled farther up a chain of command than morality ever did. He signed it, clipped it, and sent it onward. The next week, a crate arrived with more canvas and 2 folding screens, stamped with a supply code. No note, no praise, just equipment. Brooks carried one screen into the yard himself and set it upright without being told. Reed helped, hands steady. Aiko saw the new screen from behind the barracks window slats and felt a quiet tightening in her throat, not from sadness, but from recognition that something once fragile had become ordinary. The war did not end in that moment. The camp did not open its gates, but a standard had been planted, and it held, because one man had refused to let power become a performance, and because others, watching, had learned how to keep that refusal alive. Years later, the war would be measured in headlines and dates, in surrender documents and parades, in numbers that fit neatly on paper. But in Aiko Tanaka's memory, the war was also measured in smaller units, the kind you could carry without a suitcase. A strip of canvas, the scratch of a pencil signing a note, a captain's voice refusing to turn a procedure into a public lesson in shame. When the camp finally changed, as all camps eventually did, it did not happen with fireworks. It happened with lists, with transfers, with gates opened for some and paperwork delayed for others. The day Aiko's name was called, she stood, smoothed the front of her issued shirt, and stepped forward without rushing. Mrs. Sato followed behind her, clutching a small bundle of belongings that looked too light to represent a life. They were escorted through the familiar corridor of fences and posted signs, past the same yard where the canvas screens still stood, now sun-faded at the edges. Aiko noticed the screens first, because she always noticed the thing that had changed the air. 2 new guards were on duty, men she did not recognize, their posture straight, their eyes trained outward. They looked bored, which was a strange comfort. Boredom meant the boundary held so well that it no longer felt like a decision. It felt like a rule. Captain Robert Hale was not in the yard that morning. His unit had been reassigned months earlier, his desk cleared, his name likely a line on a roster in some other location. Sergeant Daniel Brooks was there, older around the eyes, still rigid in his movements, still careful with his clipboard. When he saw Aiko and Mrs. Sato pass, he hesitated, as if he recognized something he did not want to name. He lifted his hand, not in a wave, not in a salute, just a small gesture that said, "Keep moving." Corporal Ethan Reed was also gone, rotated out with the usual churn of men and orders, perhaps back home, perhaps somewhere else, carrying the memory of a canvas screen like an invisible piece of gear. Aiko walked past the screen and did not slow, but her gaze touched it the way someone touches a scar to confirm it is real. On the other side of the fence line, a truck waited to take them to the next stage of repatriation processing. The world beyond the camp looked impossibly wide. Open sky, distant water, the line where light met the horizon. It should have felt like freedom. Instead it felt like something more complicated, because survival always left a residue. On the truck, Mrs. Sato sat down carefully, as if she was still obeying a chalk line, then looked at Aiko and spoke in a low voice. Aiko listened, then answered quietly, her words simple. They did not talk about politics. They did not talk about revenge. They talked about the moment that had made them both hold their heads a little higher, even when the rest of the world had tried to teach them to lower them. In later years, when people asked Aiko what she remembered most, she did not describe the camp's layout or the uniforms or the ration tastes. She described the pause, the second of stillness when an order could have become a humiliation and did not. She described how the men in the yard went silent, not because they were threatened, but because they were forced to witness a limit. She described the difference between power that takes and power that restrains itself. She never romanticized it. She did not call Captain Hale a savior. She did not claim that camp became kind. She simply said that for one afternoon, in a place designed to strip people down to numbers, an American officer chose to treat privacy as a standard rather than a privilege. And that choice traveled farther than he probably knew. Because after that, it was written down. It was repeated. It became ordinary. And that is how decency survives wars. Not as a speech, not as a myth, but as a rule enforced by quiet people who refuse to perform cruelty. Captain Hale did not raise his voice that day. He raised the standard, and in doing so, he reminded everyone watching that victory did not have to include humiliation to count as victory.